Hello there. Hope everyone's well. Um, it's been a very tiring time at the moment, so uh, apologies if I'm not very fast or sparkly on this video. Um, but I just wanted to note down a few things. Um, I've been working on the elements system, which was first put together by Tamar de Jong and his colleagues back in the 1960s, and that's been a very interesting thing. And it brings a lot of things down to earth and makes a lot of things a lot more plain and simple than many esoteric systems do. And it's one of the reasons why I do recommend it. Um, Now, there have been some other things that have been coming up as well. I've been reminded of, the Maat current recently from looking at stuff to do with Frater Ached, Charles Stanford Jones, and his thing about the inauguration of the Aeon of Maat, which he declared in 1948, and which was then brought forward in terms of prominence by Nima, and in about 1974 or so, with her book, is it Liber Pane Penumbra, the book of the foreshadowing of the feather. Anyway, um, obviously a lot of stuff has happened with that. It's something which I was involved with before one of my breakthroughs when I was about 30 or so. When I was about 30 or so, it was a kind of breakthrough. It was a very powerful thing, and it was also just after that that I found, Michael Bertio's Gnostic Workbook for the first time, as well. A lot of things strike me now about this thing about the Aeon of Maat, particularly with the sort of age we live in right now. For those that don't know, in Thelema, which is Crowley's system, we entered the Aeon of Horus in 1904, and this is the Aeon of the Crowned and Conquering Child. It's the age of force and fire. It's an age of breakdown, and I think you can see a lot of that. There's been a lot of that. But then, what Achad put forward, and which Nima brought forward as well, was that the age to follow the Aeon of Horus was meant to be the Aeon of Maat, the Aeon of truth and justice. But the conjecture was that the Aeon of Maat could run concurrently with the Aeon of Horus, so there would be a kind of a twin Aeon in a sense. When I look at the world today, though, I think one of the biggest things to be aware of, and this goes with the whole idea of the age of Aquarius as well, is that one of the biggest problems we face is a falsification of Martian themes, such as things to do with truth and justice, particularly if we see about the hysteria that we have over so-called social justice and verification of facts and truth, and to see how these have all been taken over by corporate interests and by political ideologies, and have effectively made a falsification of these themes and tried to enforce them as a means of control and a means of as a means of control and shaping society, not according to anything spiritual, truthfully, but according to political ideology. And this is bringing about phenomena which you could, you know, completely unironically describe as Orwellian. I mean, truthfully, I know many people say this, but it's strikingly so. And so I think one of the big things to remember is that one of the damaging things we face is a falsification of the age of Maat, or of Martian influence upon the age of Horus. And it's the same thing that one would imagine happening if the age of Aquarius were actually starting to happen, because every age has its shadow. And so this is something, we have to bear in mind. It's become extraordinary. One thing that certainly I think is a very good guide to these things is that we are dealing with something spiritual, and spirituality and politics are two different areas. If somebody's presenting a spiritual thing as politics or as political, you can pretty much guarantee it's going to go off the rails, and it's going to be subject to distortion and falsification. So, under no circumstances do I feel anybody should be pursuing a spirituality such as the Maat current through politics. I've criticized politics to various people, to my friends. People often think that it's a matter of, well, yes, the politicians are really bad, aren't they? Yeah, well, duh. The vast majority of politicians always are bad, always are substandard. This is a deeply flawed and highly mundane area. So, of course, there is the odd exception. There's the odd exception when something genuinely spiritual occurs in the political sphere, and when it does, that person is usually killed or got rid of or sidelined. That's what generally happens. As with, say, Martin Luther King or something like that. It's very rare that politics leads anywhere that's really that good. It will take up the rearguard of things, it will exploit what has actually changed, and it will claim it for itself, certainly. But politics is a dreadful, dreadful business. So, when I criticize politics, I'm not criticizing particular politicians, essentially. I'm saying that politics as a whole is a game. It's not a spiritual game. Politics as a whole is a game. And when you are looking to something genuinely spiritual, it will never be attainable through politics. And I'm including political activists in that as well. Anybody that's driven by ideology. So that's my view on it. We have to be very careful of things, and we have to simplify things. Bring things back home to our own lives and our own actual real life relationships, which make up our real community connections. We need to bring things back to that, bring things back to spirituality, and bring things back to our own development and our own maturation. You have plenty to work on there. When somebody starts talking about changing the world, just know that the best they will be able to do is destroy. You can work with how the world changes if you have worked to understand it. You can work with that. You can make the best of everything. But this change the world, utopianism via politics is an absolute poison. And I would say that quite unequivocally. Now, in the area of the element studies, which I was very interested in when I was younger, and I'm interested in again now. There's a lot of stuff there between fire consciousness and water consciousness, which basically a lot of that comes from Richard Gardner. Though Tamo and his people took it up as well, though they say that it came from Richard Gardner in the credits to one of Tamo's books, Analog's books, Analog as he became known. There is a problem, a severe problem, with imagining that this is some sort of almost like a physics thing where you just put an equal and opposite force in place. Yeah. Water consciousness itself is not necessarily the answer to fire consciousness, because Richard thought that we had become dominated by fire consciousness, which is what leads to our present situation. If somebody's got an acid burn, the answer to that is not to simply pour an alkali upon it. Yeah. The important thing is, the elemental consciousness as it is manifesting in people's lives, is it in virtue or not? That is the important thing. And just as somebody doesn't need to become 100% balanced in all the elements in their nature, no, they just need to become in virtue in what they have, and then they will have their connection with the whole, and they will tend to become more balanced. But this idea, similarly to the idea of the pendulum swing, which is, again, is a sort of political idea, and a disastrous one, the idea that you go from one fault over to the other fault, and this will somehow give you something in the middle, which is, a median. It won't. It will just create chaos. It will create chaos and delusion, and that's what we find. So you can see this in all sorts of places. With all the stuff to do with things like patriarchy theory, and people think that masculine consciousness is the cause of so much awfulness, so we just bring in feminine consciousness and that will solve things. That's absolute rubbish. It's absolute rubbish. You need all forms of consciousness in virtue. That's what you need. But the point is, start with where you are, come into virtue, and then the elements relate to each other. That's how I view that. And so it's sort of it does sort of like fit in with the problem of politics as well, because politics really can't understand these things, because politics has of itself no virtue that it has not borrowed from spirituality. In the age of secularism, virtue borrowed from spirituality is then left to simply decay into something which is cut off from its source, and which cannot stay as virtue. It will degrade. It will decay. So the important thing is spirituality, really. Spirituality, virtue, bringing things back home, keeping things simple, working on yourself, living the best life you can, and making your relationships good. Spiritually, who knows what can happen? Spiritually, who knows what can come about? And that is one of the inspirations of the Maat current. But the great thing to be aware of and to be careful of is that these things are not colonized by negative air consciousness, by a falsification of the very things which the Maat current is meant to be associated with. That is, I don't know what the word for it was, a kind of blasphemy, really. It's an awful situation because you're taking something of great hope and then defacing it and placing a counterfeit in its place. That's a way of preventing something happening, and so don't prevent it. Find the spiritual ways to get there, because that will actually subsist, I believe. Now, just as a postscript, I just wanted to say that when I'm talking about fire consciousness and water consciousness not being the answer to fire consciousness, I don't mean by that water consciousness is not something of immense value, or that it's not something which is potentially miraculous. I think these things are true, but what I mean is that any form of consciousness, any form of elemental consciousness which is not in virtue cannot bring about anything good. And so simply saying that water consciousness, as if it were a virtue in itself, will be the answer to fire consciousness is, I think, deluded, and I think it's a sort of delusion which was, you could see it in quite a lot of mid-20th century esotericism, witchcraft and stuff like that, and all people's ideas, matriarchy versus patriarchy, etc., etc. It doesn't deal with the core question, which is what is the quality of consciousness involved. And so this idea that, again, it's almost using a mechanistic model to deal with it. We will just pour more of this in this into a situation, and it will solve it. It doesn't. So that's what I meant by that.